The Forbidden Walk. I have been working as a concierge in a luxury building for almost 2 years. Always thought this kind of job was quiet. A fancy place, polite locals, no big surprises. But that night everything changed. The building has 15 floors, at least officially, but the layout always seemed strange to me. There is something out of the ordinary in the control system of the building. From day one, I was told to ignore any call or alert related to floor 13. At the time, I thought it was some silly superstition because they say that many buildings do not have this floor. But the strange thing is that the elevator panel has no button for the 13th, only an empty space. Even so, the security system still shows a floor 13 on the digital map, which has always bothered me. That night, everything was quiet until the system started to whistle. It was not unusual for sensors to detect something, like a strange movement that turned out to be an error, a pet cat or a bag in the wind near the external cameras. But when I looked at the panel, I felt a chill in my spine. The alert came from floor 13. The display clearly showed, motion detected. My heart started beating faster. Normally, I would just ignore it. After all, that was the rule. But the fact that it appeared in the system was already bizarre enough to make me uneasy. I spent a few minutes standing still, looking at the monitor, hoping that the alert would disappear alone. Only it did not go away. I tried to keep calm, but it was difficult. It was as if something was calling me to do exactly the opposite of what I was told from day one. I kept looking at the monitor, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a bug. After all, floor 13 should not even exist. But what I saw next made my stomach turn. The camera showed a corridor. It was not any corridor, but one that I had never seen before. The lights were flashing, as if the electrical system was failing. For a second, I was sure that I saw a shadow pass quickly through the corner of the screen, but when I looked again, the corridor was empty. I wanted to ignore it, turn off the monitor and pretend nothing was happening, but that bad feeling didn't go away. The alert kept flashing, as if it insisted I had to do something. I looked at the radio, thinking about calling the security guard for the morning shift, but I knew it would sound crazy. Hey, I'm seeing a movement on the floor that doesn't exist. Who would believe that? After a few more minutes of tension, I made a decision that was perhaps the worst in my life. I decided to investigate. Took the keys of general access. I put the radio in my pants and went into the elevator. The doors closed, and for the first time I noticed that there was a bigger space between buttons 12 and 14. My finger hesitated for a moment, hovering in that empty space between the buttons. It was irrational, but part of me felt that if I touched there, something would happen. I shook my head, trying to get myself together, and pressed the button on the 12th floor. My idea was to go up there and then use the stairs to see if the 13th floor really existed. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, everything was quiet, as it should be at that early hour. Took the flashlight out of my pocket, a habit I never thought would be useful, but at that time it seemed a necessity, and went towards the staircase. The staircase was lit, but the silence was oppressive. Each step seemed to make a deafening noise in the concrete. When I got to what was supposed to be the space between the 12th and 14th floors, my heart almost stopped. There was a door. It was not marked, without a number, without any sign indicating what it was. Only a simple metal door, with a slight peeling in the paint. I tried to turn the handle, but it was locked. The problem is that before I could decide what to do, I heard a noise from the other side. A muffled sound, as if someone was whispering, but could not understand any words. It was a low but steady sound, and seemed to get closer and closer. My legs trembled, but I kept moving forward, as if something beyond my will pulled me forward. I knew I should turn around and run, but the sound of that murmur seemed to hold me. When I approached the door from where the loudest noise came, I noticed that it was half open, letting out a weak and trembling light, as if from a candle. I bent down to try to see without making a noise, but what I saw made me choke with fear. The room was empty, completely empty. There was no furniture, people, or any apparent light source, but the luminosity was still there, oscillating on the walls as if something invisible was burning. Before I could understand what was happening, I felt a shiver coming up through my spine. Behind me, the corridor seemed to be closing. The doors that were half open before now were completely open. And inside, something moved. It was not possible to distinguish exact shapes, but they were shadows that seemed to writhe in an unnatural way, as if space was not enough to contain them. I heard footsteps echoing, many steps, but there was no one visible. The only thing I could do was to slowly back up, still pointing the flashlight all over, until I touched something solid. I turned, desperate, and realized that it was facing another door, unlike all the others. It was made of old wood and had scratched nail marks, as if someone had tried to get out of there at any cost. My mind was in panic. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to open that door, as if it were my only way out. The scratches gave me chills, but at the same time seemed like a warning. I held the handle, which was cold as ice, and turned it slowly. The door opened with a long, agonizing creak. On the other side, a small and empty room, except for something that made my blood freeze. A wooden chair placed right in the center, with a rope hanging from the ceiling just above it. The rope was swinging slightly, as if someone had just left it there. And the smell, a metallic and nauseating smell that I could not identify immediately. Before I could process it, the door behind me slammed hard, as if it had been pushed by a gust of wind, but the corridor was completely without ventilation. I ran to try and open it again, but it was useless. It was locked, or maybe something else. Then the chair started creaking. Just hearing the sound, I felt my breath hold. When I turned, I almost fainted with terror. There were footprints on the dusty floor, forming a trail that led up to the wall, as if someone was walking through the room. Only that there was no one there. Or rather, there was no one I could see. I didn't know what to do. Every fiber of my body screamed for me to run, but I was stuck there, with the suffocating feeling that I wasn't alone. The tracks on the floor made no sense. They went to the wall and simply disappeared. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, but it was in vain. When I stepped back, I stumbled on something. I looked down and saw that it was a small metallic object covered by a thin layer of dust. I picked up with my trembling hands and realized that it was a keychain with a single number engraved, 13. My vision began to become cloudy, as if the air around me was being drained, and it was then that the sound began. It was like a low, distorted laugh, reverberating through the room, with no apparent origin. I wanted to scream, but my voice did not come out. The light of the flashlight began to flash, and, in the middle of the flashes, I saw something. It was a tall, distorted figure standing in the corner of the room, as if it had come out of the shadows. She didn't move, but I could feel her watching me. The light of the flashlight went out for good, and for a few seconds everything was in absolute silence. Then I felt something touch my shoulder. It was not a strong touch, but it was enough to make me turn sharply, slamming the door with the weight of my own body. I turned so fast that I almost knocked the lantern over, but there was nothing behind me. The touch, however, still seemed to burn in my skin, as if something had really touched me. The breath became heavy, and the feeling that that room was alive was impossible to ignore. The distorted laughter had stopped, but now I could hear something else. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere within the walls. The problem is that with each beat, it seemed closer, as if something was approaching. When I realized this, despair took over. I started knocking on the door, screaming for help, but no sound seemed to echo. It was then that I noticed that the keychain was still in my hand. At that moment, an absurd idea occurred to me. Perhaps the key he pointed out was the way out. Turned back to the room and looked desperately, passing the lantern through every corner. It was when the light stopped on the chair. Now something was in it. It was impossible to describe what I saw without feeling a lump in my stomach. It was not exactly a person, but it seemed to have a human form, completely wrong. The arms were too long, and the head hung to the side as if the neck was broken. I swear his eyes opened slowly and looked at me. I stuck in place, feeling my whole body freezing. The figure began to rise, and the sound of wood squealing took me out of trance. I didn't even think about it. I just started moving, stumbling as I tried to open the door again. My hands trembled so much that it seemed impossible to turn the handle. Behind me, the sound of steps echoed through the room, closer and closer. It was as if the ground was vibrating under the weight of that, and I knew that if I did not come out of there, something terrible would happen. Finally, the door gave way, opening with a bang that almost knocked me down. I ran out through the dark corridor without looking back, because I felt that if I looked, I would find that thing following me. The doors along the corridor were now all open, and a cold wind was blowing through there, making a sound that sounded like a lament. When I reached the end of the corridor, something made me stop abruptly. The elevator was there, with the doors open, but inside there was no cabin, only an empty and deep well. It was as if the elevator had disappeared. My despair reached its apex. I looked back, and the corridor seemed longer than before, with the shadows moving on their own. I ran up the stairs, stumbling on the steps, while the sound of something chasing me echoed behind me. Finally, I reached the door that led to the 12th floor and opened it with all the force I had left. When I looked back before closing it, the corridor was completely empty. No doors opened, no shadows, no sound. Only absolute silence. Closed the door with force and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart seemed about to explode, and I still could not believe what had just happened. The staircase was lit, silent, as if nothing had happened. I ran up to the reception without looking back, tripping on my own feet. When I arrived at the lobby, the place was just as I had left it. Empty, quiet, only the low sound of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time. But as normal as it seemed, I knew something was wrong. I looked at the security monitor, and floor 13 was still marked, blinking red. This time, however, the alert said authorized access. It didn't make sense. I should never have gone in there. I pressed the button to call the supervisor, but before he answered, the monitor went off. I stood there, staring at the black screen, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing happened. The rest of the shift passed in an uncomfortable silence, and as soon as my replacement arrived in the morning, I left without saying anything. I tried to act normal, but something changed. Since that night, I feel like I'm being watched. At home, at work, even on the street. It's as if something had come with me from that place. I did not work in that building again. I quit the next day, citing personal reasons. But the truth is that, even today, I still dream about that corridor, with the shadows, with the figure in the chair. And the worst of it is that deep down, I feel that it's not over yet. A remote Airbnb in the forest. I was never a fan of being isolated in the middle of nowhere, but my girlfriend thought it would be a good idea to rent a cabin on Airbnb, to spend a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cabin was in the middle of a forest, about 40 minutes away from the nearest town. It looked charming and well cared for in the photos, and the price was very good. The owner sent us detailed instructions right after booking, which I found a bit strange because most of the rules didn't make sense. He mentioned things like don't turn on the outside lights after 9 p.m. and completely ignore anyone who shows up at the door during the night. We thought it was funny at first, as if they were just eccentricities of a neurotic host, but when we got there, the atmosphere changed. The place was beautiful, but there was something that seemed wrong. I can't explain it, but it was as if the forest around it was too dense, almost suffocating. We did not see anyone on the way to the hut, which was expected considering the isolation, but the silence was so absolute that it bothered me. We entered the cabin in the late afternoon, and inside, everything was exactly as described in the ad. Cozy, rustic, but functional. However, some things were out of place. For example, the thick curtains that covered all the windows were fastened with nails on top, as if the owner wanted to ensure that no one pulled them aside. Also, by the door was a handwritten note, reinforcing the same rules we had already received. Under no circumstances turn on the external lights after 21 hours was tangled, as if it were more important than the rest. The first part of the evening was quiet. We made dinner, drank some wine, and tried to ignore how oppressive the silence outside was. Around 8:30, my girlfriend commented that the place was much darker than she imagined. It was true. The hut had no neighbors, and without outside lights, the darkness was almost absolute. You could not see anything through the window, even forcing the view. Just a few minutes to 21H, we decided to turn off all the lights and use only the fireplace, more for fun than to believe in the rules. The clock struck 21H, and everything was even quieter. Even the few noises of the forest, like the rustling of leaves or the singing of some cricket, had disappeared. It was then that we heard the first beat. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was very clear. It looked like someone was knocking on the front door, calmly but insistently. My first reaction was to think it was some animal, maybe a branch or something. But then the beat came again, this time stronger. I exchanged a look with my girlfriend, and she seemed as confused as me. I remembered the rules and the notice of the host: ignore anyone who appears at the door during the night. But ignoring it was easier said than done. I went to the door without opening and stood for a moment, trying to hear something. It was when a female voice came from the other side, low, almost whispering. "Please help me. It's very dark out here." My heart shot at the same time. That voice seemed normal, but something in it did not sound right. It was as if she was muffled, without emotion, almost as if someone was imitating a distress call. My girlfriend came to me, holding my arm tightly, and whispered that we should open the door. I knew this was a bad idea, but I couldn't think straight. The voice continued, "Please, I'm lost. I just need a place to stay until dawn." The logic told me that no one should be there. There were no houses nearby, and the place was so isolated that it was unlikely anyone would be wandering through the forest in the dark. Trying to control my fear, I asked, "Who is there? How did you get here?" There was no immediate response, only silence. I waited a few seconds, and then the beats resumed, this time faster, almost desperate. My girlfriend started to panic, saying we should call the police, but their cell phones had no signal. The Wi-Fi in the cabin was weak and did not carry anything. It was at this point that the voice changed. I can't explain how, but her tone became more serious, almost dragged, and she repeated, "Please open the door." This time it sounded like someone was making fun of us, as if they knew we were terrified. By then, I knew something was very wrong. The beats stopped suddenly, but the feeling that there was someone outside did not disappear. I looked through the small opening of the curtain stuck in the window next to the door, but I could not see anything other than darkness. I tried to calm my girlfriend down, saying it was better to follow the rules and be quiet. She was sitting on the couch, hugging her knees, visibly terrified. The silence seemed even heavier, as if the air had become dense, difficult to breathe. And then, without warning, we heard footsteps on the deck of the cabin. They were slow and rhythmic, as if someone was walking from side to side deliberately. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The outside lights, which should not be on, began to flash. There was no way they were connected. I had checked the switch myself before it got dark. The whole hut was taken by a faint and intermittent brightness, enough to cast strange shadows on the walls. I went to the window of the room and looked carefully out. At first, it seemed like there was nothing, but then I saw something moving between the trees. It was hard to tell what it was, but it looked like a tall figure with strange movements, almost erratic. My body froze. It was not possible that that was a person. The figure stopped moving and stood there, motionless, at the edge of the forest, as if it was watching us. As much as I wanted to look away, it was impossible. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The silhouette was thin, tall, with disproportionately long arms that hung to the side of the body. I knew that I should move away from the window, but it was as if something held me there, as if looking was worse but inevitable. It was only when my girlfriend called me, almost screaming, I could move. "The lights in the hallway," she said. I turned quickly and saw that the lights inside the cabin were also flashing, one by one, as if something was running through the place. Before we could react, the knocking started again, but this time at the back door. They were strong, unsettled, as if someone was punching with all their might. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that we were surrounded. My girlfriend started crying, begging us to leave, but I knew it was a bad idea. Opening any door would mean exposing ourselves to whatever it was. I locked all the doors and approached the fireplace, picking up the poker as a makeshift weapon. What terrified me the most was the idea that if I entered, there would be nowhere to run. And the feeling of being watched did not stop. It was as if dozens of eyes were fixed on us, waiting. The beats stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving an almost deafening silence. It was as if the air itself had frozen. My girlfriend was clinging to a pillow, shaking, while I stood by the fireplace trying to look like she was in control, but could barely hold the poker without my hands trembling. I decided to take a look through the back window, even though every instinct told me not to. I leaned slowly, lifting only a little bit of the curtain, and felt my heart stop. The figure I had seen before in the woods was now on the back deck. It was even more frightening up close. The skin seemed unnaturally stretched, as if it was too thin to cover what was underneath. As I watched her, she turned her head slowly, as if she knew exactly where I was. No eyes, only dark holes that seemed to suck any light around. Despair took hold of me, ran back to my girlfriend, and whispered to her that we needed to lock ourselves in a room. She could hardly walk, so scared, but we managed to climb the stairs and lock ourselves in the main room. As we locked the door, we heard the sound of something heavy dragging downstairs, as if it was being pushed across the floor of the room. I didn't know what it was, but I was sure it wasn't out there. It was inside the cabin. We were in the room, with the door locked, but that didn't make me feel safer. The feeling that something was inside the cabin was unbearable. My girlfriend was crying in silence, and I tried to hear any sound coming from below. For a few minutes there was nothing, only absolute silence. Then the sound of footsteps began. First slow, heavy, as if something was walking down the hall downstairs. Then they got faster but not regular, like short runs followed by abrupt stops. It was impossible to know where it was exactly. It seemed like the sound came from all sides at once. I tried to find something in the room that could be used as a weapon. The only thing I found was a heavy lamp on the bedside table. I caught it, feeling completely ridiculous, as if that would make a difference. Then the banging started again, but this time on the door of the room. They were lighter than before, but much more sinister. 3 precise beats, followed by a long pause. Then another 3. My girlfriend put her hands in her mouth so she wouldn't scream, and I could just stand there, staring at the door as if she was going to collapse any moment. The voice came back. It was no longer the dragged tone of before, but a low whisper right at the door. "You let me in?" That question froze my body. It was not just the tone of her voice, but the way she sounded, as if she was talking right next to the door, almost inside the room. I could not answer. I just stood still, trying to control my breath. My girlfriend looked at me with wide eyes, as if she expected me to do something, but what could I do? 3 more beats, this time louder. "Will you let me in?" He repeated, his voice now louder. It was as if he knew we were completely defenseless. Then the silence came back, but I knew that it was still there. The silence was almost worse than the beats. Outside the door, it seemed that the air was charged, as if something was moving but without making any sound. Then, out of nowhere, the lights in the hut went completely out. The only thing that illuminated the room was the faint glow of the lantern we had brought and left in the corner of the bed. I took the lantern with trembling hands and pointed to the door, as if it was going to protect us. It was at this moment that we heard the most horrible sound of the night, something scratching the door slowly, with an almost sadistic calm. The sound cut through silence like a blade. My girlfriend started crying again, and I knew that if it got in, we wouldn't have a chance. But then suddenly everything stopped. Silence returned, and it seemed that the whole hut had been empty. I looked at the door, expecting the worst, but nothing happened. The rest of the night passed without any sound, no more banging or scratching. When the sun finally rose, we left the cabin without looking back. The silence of the counties. I started working as a community security guard just a few weeks ago. It was one of those places that seemed too perfect to be true. Everything well organized, clean streets, large and spotless houses. Most of the residents were retired, and the vibe was so peaceful that sometimes it felt like being in a movie set. My shift was night, which initially didn't bother me because I thought it would be easy. I just needed to drive around the perimeter, check the gates, and make sure everything was in order. But on my first day, something caught my attention, a specific and strange instruction in the manual they gave me. There was a warning highlighted: ignore any light, sound, or movement in Unit 66 after 22 hours. At the time, I laughed alone. I thought it was some kind of internal joke or, I don't know, exaggerated caution against moaning residents. Unit 66 was located in a more isolated part of the community, at the end of a dead-end street. I had not seen anyone living there until then, and during the day it looked like an ordinary house. Still, the rule was hammering in my head. Why such a specific orientation? The first nights, I passed by Unit 66 at a glance, always before 22H, and everything seemed normal. But that particular night, something was different. It was 10:05 when I noticed a dim light coming from one of the windows. It looked like a candle or something. My instinct was to go away, but curiosity spoke louder. Against the rules, I parked the car a little further and decided to check. Left the car with the flashlight in hand, trying not to make a sound. The light in the window blinked irregularly, as if it was swaying in the wind. When I approached the house, I noticed something strange. Unit 66 seemed older and poorly maintained than the other houses. The paint was worn, the grass in the garden was high, and some windows had boards nailed to the inside. It looked abandoned, but that light, it made no sense. I looked around to make sure no one was watching what I was doing, and went to the side of the house. The window from which the light came was half open, and I could spy without much effort. Inside, what I saw made me freeze. It was an empty room, but there was a circle drawn on the floor with something that seemed to be salt or white powder. Inside the circle, there were several candles lit and a chair in the center. But the worst was to realize that the chair was not empty. There was a person sitting there, or at least something that looked like a person. He was completely still, with his back to the window. Just looking at it, I felt a shiver so strong that I can barely breathe. It didn't seem natural. The head was slightly tilted to one side, and the arms were hanging down, as if the thing was disconnected from itself. Before I could move away, the figure moved his head slowly, as if he had felt my presence. The moment the figure started turning my head, my reaction was instinctive. I leaned down and held my breath. My heart seemed to explode in my chest, and my hands trembled so much that I could barely hold the flashlight. I waited for a few seconds, without moving, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was the fruit of my imagination. Maybe it was just a mannequin or someone playing. But as I was sitting there, I heard a sound coming from inside the house. It was like a whisper, low and dragged, but impossible to understand. The window I was peeking from began to creak, as if it were being closed slowly. The sound made me jump backwards, stumbling and almost falling to the ground. When I finally got up, I quickly walked away from the house, but then I noticed something even more bizarre. There was no light coming from the window. Everything was dark now, as if nothing had happened. I looked back as I got to the car, and the house looked even more sinister in the dark. I just wanted to get out of there, but something caught my attention. In front of Unit 66, there was a small group of residents standing in the middle of the street. There were 3 or 4 people, all elderly, dressed in sleeping clothes. They did not move, just watched me in silence. Don't know how long I stood there, staring at those figures in the dark, but the feeling was that they knew exactly what I had done. Those people stood still, without saying a word, just looking at me. It was impossible to distinguish the faces right in the darkness, but their posture was strange, almost unnatural. I could not move for a few seconds, as if I was stuck by that collective look. Then, without warning, one of them raised her arm and pointed directly at me. It was enough to get me out of the trance. I got into the car almost tripping, turned on the engine, and left as fast as I could. On the way back to the security post, my mind was at 1,000. Who were those people? And why did they seem to know that I was spying on the house? When I got to the post, I went straight to the security cameras, trying to see what had happened. The footage showed the street where Unit 66 is, but what I saw made me even more terrified. There was no one. None of the residents I had seen were there. The strange thing is that in the corner of the screen, near the house, you could see a slight oscillation in the light, as if something was pulsating. I tried to advance the video to see if anything else appeared, but before I could continue, the system restarted itself. The recordings of that moment simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. It was then that I realized that the silence had taken over everything around me. Even inside the post, it seemed that the sound of the world had disappeared. I sat in the post chair, trying to calm down and organize my thoughts, but I couldn't stop looking at the camera monitor. The image came back after a few minutes, but now it seemed normal. The street empty, lights of the houses out, nothing abnormal. Still, something didn't feel right. I decided to take a last look around the perimeter before closing the shift. I took the flashlight and went to the car again, but this time I felt a strange resistance when leaving the post. It was as if the air was heavier, making even my breathing difficult. When I got to the street of Unit 66, I slowed down just to make sure everything was in order. As I passed the house, I noticed that the front door was open. Not completely, but enough to let a crack of light escape from inside. My heart was racing. I thought about just driving, but something stopped the car. Perhaps it was the feeling that if I ignored it, I would never have peace. When I went down and started walking towards the house, a sound that I will never forget echoed through the street. Something between a cry and a cry, but distorted, as if it had been dragged by something that was not human. My instincts were screaming for me to come back, but it was too late. I looked to the side, and at the end of the street, the same residents that I had seen before were there again, standing still, looking. I froze in place. They were closer this time, still motionless, but now it was possible to see more details. Their faces looked normal at first glance, but something in their eyes was wrong. It was as if they were empty, without any emotion or even life. They did not blink, did not move, just kept looking directly at me. At that moment, I knew I had made a mistake when getting out of the car. I wanted to run, but my legs were locked. Suddenly the door of Unit 66 began to open slowly, and the squeaking sound was so loud that it echoed through the entire street. There was no wind, no movement beyond that. The darkness inside the house seemed deeper than anything I had ever seen. Then something came out of the house. I don't know how to describe it. It was a tall but disproportionate silhouette, as if trying to look like a person, but could not. Every step he took towards me seemed erratic, as if I was not used to walking. The sound of his steps was heavy, muffled, but had a disturbing rhythm. Before I could think of anything, I felt a weight on my shoulder. Not physically, but as if something pushed me to look back. When I turned my head, the villagers had come even closer. They were a few meters away from me, forming a circle. I did not scream, I did not run, did nothing. I just stood there, waiting for whatever to happen. I knew there was no way out. That thing coming out of Unit 66 kept moving towards me, but it was as if time had slowed down. The figures around me, the residents, were still motionless, but now it was possible to hear a low sound coming from them, like a hum. It seemed like everything was spinning around me, and my body just didn't respond. The only thing I could do was to look at that silhouette coming from the house. When she stopped a few meters from me, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Her face, or what seemed to be a face, was not fixed. It was as if you were changing, swaying between different expressions, but none of them seemed really human. Suddenly, everything stopped. The hum ceased, the residents disappeared as if they were never there, and the silhouette simply crumbled, as if made of smoke. There was no more sound, movement, nothing. I stood there, standing in the middle of the street, trying to understand what had just happened. When I finally got to move, I ran back to the car, stepped in and accelerated without looking back. I never came back to that community. I resigned the same week, without giving any explanation, and even today I cannot erase that night from my mind. I still wake up sometimes hearing that hum or seeing those standing figures watching me. I don't know what the 66 unit was, nor what I saw there, but I'm sure it wasn't something of this world. The Forbidden Wing. I have been working as a junior technician in an underground lab for just over 6 months. The place is known to be extremely safe and frankly quite strict with the rules. At first, I thought it was too much, a badge for each door, access restrictions in various sectors, and that insistence on never deviating from the protocols. Everything seemed very professional, but normal. Until one day during the night shift, I noticed something strange. My job was basically to check the servers in the main area and make sure everything was working perfectly. But that night some alerts started showing up. It was a digital noise, as if there were interference in the data. The problem? The interference came from a forbidden sector called only Ward 3. I knew Ward 3 existed, of course. I passed it every day on my way to shift, but no one could enter. The door was locked with a biometric system, and only superiors were allowed to access. The lights in the corridor leading there were weaker, and silence was always heavier in that area. I decided to ignore the alert at first, but it kept coming back, blinking on the control monitor. I could feel my curiosity increasing. Against the protocol, I tried to run a deeper analysis to see what was generating that interference, but all I got was a sequence of corrupted codes. It was as if something was inside the system, but at the same time out of my reach. It didn't make sense. After a few minutes trying to understand what was happening, another alert appeared. It was an activity log indicating that something was consuming energy inside Ward 3. The bizarre part is that, as far as I knew, that sector should be completely off during the night. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore it, but that anomaly detected warning kept flashing on the screen. I decided that I needed to at least check the records in the system to reassure myself. When I accessed the logs, I saw that the last access recorded to that ward was weeks ago, but the power consumption was active since the beginning of my shift. Then something even stranger happened. The lights in the corridor of the sector where I was started to blink. It was not unusual that this happened sporadically, but this time it was different. The flashing pattern seemed to follow a rhythm, almost as if it were purposeful. The sound of the servers also sounded different. It was hard to describe, but it was like a static noise mixed with something deeper, almost like a severe buzzing. I looked around, trying to convince myself that it was just paranoia, but my body was already tense, as if something was wrong. It was at this moment that I heard the sound, a slight drag coming from far away, exactly in the direction of Ward 3. I wanted to run, but couldn't move. The sound of the drag kept coming closer and louder, as if I was gaining weight. Finally, my flashlight went back on, and the light lit up the door to Ward 3. I was wide open now, and for a brief moment, I saw something coming out. I don't know how to describe it. It looked like an arm, but it wasn't human. It was elongated, with a wrinkled texture and a color that I couldn't identify. The thing stretched on the ground, as if trying to feel the environment, looking for something. My whole body was shaking, but somehow I managed to take a few steps back without making any noise. I knew that if that thing noticed my presence, I would have no chance of escaping. As I slowly drifted away, the sound of the drag stopped. Everything was silent. That should be a relief, but it was even worse. The silence was oppressive, as if the environment itself was waiting for something. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, which was panting. Then I saw. In the corner of the corridor, Right next to the door of Ward 3, two small and weak lights appeared, like eyes shining in the dark. They didn't blink, just stared at me, as if they were analyzing every move I made. I knew I had to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were stuck on the ground. Suddenly the lights went out, and the sound of the drag came back, but this time, coming from all directions. The sound coming from all directions was maddening. It was as if it were multiplying, or the space around me was distorted. Somehow, I managed to move. I started running back to the control room, without looking back. Every step I took seemed to echo in an exaggerated way, as if the corridor was amplifying the sound. When I finally reached the room, I locked the door and threw myself against it, trying to catch my breath. The silence came back once again, but now it seemed even more strange. I looked at the security monitors, hoping to see something, anything, but all cameras were off except the one that gave view of the hall in Ward 3. On the screen, I saw something that made me freeze. The shadow I had seen before was now lighter, standing right in the middle of the corridor. She had a grotesque shape, with elongated limbs and a body that seemed to pulsate lightly, as if it was alive in a way that made no sense. Suddenly, the creature turned his head to the camera. It was not possible to see a face, but the movement was intentional, almost as if he knew I was watching. Then, out of nowhere, the lights in the control room started flashing. The monitor went completely off, and a low sound like a buzzing filled the room. It was at that moment I realized that it was no longer in the corridor. It was there with me. When I realized that I was stuck there, I felt my body lock. The low sound became more intense, as if it vibrated inside my head. I had the lantern in my hand, but it made no difference. The lights of the room flickered so much that it was impossible to distinguish what was real and what wasn't. It was when I heard again that sound of dragging, now coming from behind me very close. I turned slowly, with my heart beating, pointing the lantern in the direction of the sound. There was nothing, but the ground was marked, as if something had really been pulled. Long and deep footprints followed towards the control table, as if something had just passed by there. Before I could understand what was happening, I felt a weight in the air. It was almost as if the atmosphere had become denser, making even my breathing difficult. A strange, metallic smell began to fill the environment, and the feeling that I was not alone only increased. Then, close to my ear, I heard a low and deep sound like a whisper, but no words that I could understand. That was enough to make me run. I left the room without looking back, ignoring the fact that I had nowhere else to go. The only thing I knew was that I needed to get away from it. I ran through the halls as if my life depended on it, and I really believed that it did. The lights blinked without stopping, creating shadows that danced through the walls, and I was sure that some of these shadows were not mine. The sound of dragging continued, now faster, as if it was following me. I tried to orient myself by the signs on the walls, but everything seemed confused, as if the layout had changed. It was when I saw something that made me freeze for a moment. The main door of the facility, which should be far away from where I was, appeared just ahead. It didn't make sense. It was as if the space had doubled in some way. Didn't think twice and ran towards the door. When I got close, I saw my badge hanging on the side of the entrance, something impossible, since I had left it in my pocket minutes before. Took the badge with trembling hands and tried to pass on the reader. The lights on the door blinked red for a moment, but miraculously it opened. As soon as I left, the sound of dragging ceased completely, and the silence of the night took hold. I turned to look for the last time, but the installation was completely out, as if there had never been light inside. Went back to my car and sped away from that place without thinking of anything else. Until today, I don't know what it was. I resign the next day, but the nightmares continue. Some nights, I wake up with the same sound of dragging and feel that it is still watching me. The neighborhood of whispers. I have been working as a postman for some years, and although it is a quiet job most of the time, some strange things have happened. But nothing made me as disturbed as what happened in the neighborhood where I was doing a fixed route. It was one of those typical suburban neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, almost identical houses, and residents always in a hurry or suspicious. A normal place, but with one detail that always bothered me. There was a house on my route, number 48, which never received mail. Never. It looked inhabited. The garden was always cut off, the curtains closed, and sometimes there was a light lit at night. But there were no mailboxes, parcels, or any name associated with that address. At first, I thought it was a rental house that was empty or something. But over time, the idea that someone lived there but never received anything began to seem wrong. It was on a regular day that the things started to get out of control. That day, they delivered a package at the center, destined for number 48. It was a small envelope, one of those half-yellow, without sender, but clearly marked for that address. I thought it was strange, since I had never seen anything registered to the house. It stuck in my head the whole way to the neighborhood, but I was determined to deliver. When I got to the street, the house looked even darker than usual, although it was a clear and sunny day. The garden seemed to have a light mist hanging over it, and for some reason, the place seemed quieter than the rest of the neighborhood. Went to the door with the envelope in my hand and rang the bell. I waited a few seconds, but no one answered. That's when I first heard the sound. It was not a loud or definite noise, but something like a murmur coming from inside the house, very low, almost as if someone was whispering. I froze for a moment, trying to hear that sound better. It was a continuous whisper, but could not understand words. It didn't seem to be just one person speaking, but several voices overlapping, all muffled, as if they were trapped behind the walls. The feeling was that I was being watched. I tried to convince myself that it was my head and knocked on the door more strongly, saying, "Mail." The sound stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so heavy that I began to hear my own breath. I decided to leave the envelope in the mailbox, but when I turned to look for it, I realized that the house did not even have a box. It was just an empty space where a person should be. Not knowing what to do, I decided to leave the envelope on the floor, right in front of the door. But as soon as I leaned down, I felt a movement next to me. It was almost imperceptible, like a quick shadow passing through the window. My heart shot up, and I got up so fast that I nearly tripped on the steps. I looked out the window, but the curtains were closed, and there was no one there. However, the feeling that something was watching me didn't go away. Before I could walk away, I heard a snap, as if the door was unlocking from the inside. The handle turned slowly, but the door did not open completely. Only a crack opened, enough for me to see a piece of the inside of the house, a dark corridor with a faint flashing light at the bottom. I was paralyzed looking at that crack in the door. The corridor was narrow, with walls of a strange tone, half embittered, as if the house had not been used for years. The blinking light in the background made shadows dance through the walls, creating shapes that seemed to move on their own. Still, there was no sound coming from inside, no steps, no voice. Just that suffocating silence. I decided it was time to go. I started to turn around to get out, but before I took the first step, I heard a voice. She was short, husky, almost impossible to understand, but clearly coming from inside the house. Why don't you come in? It was like an invitation, but it didn't sound human. It was something wrong, as if the voice was forcing the words to come out. My whole body froze. I didn't answer and started to walk quickly back to the sidewalk. But when I got close to the street, I realized that the envelope I had left was no longer there. I looked back, and the door was completely closed, as if it had never been opened. I felt my stomach turn. Who had taken the envelope? And why did no one appear? Before I could reason correctly, I noticed that the murmur had returned. This time, it was not coming from inside the house, but seemed to surround the whole garden, as if the voices were around me. I looked around desperately, but saw nothing but the trees and houses nearby, all still. The only thing I knew was that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Back to the truck as fast as I could, without looking back. When I went in, I locked the door and tried to start the engine, but my hand was so trembling that it took me a few seconds to turn the key. The sound of the voices was still in my head, even with the windows closed. It was as if they were not just whispers, but something trying to say something I couldn't understand. When I finally got to start and get away from the house, I looked in the rear view mirror by reflection. The house was there, still as always, but something seemed different. One of the second floor windows was open, and I swear I saw a figure standing there, watching me. It was just a silhouette, but made me accelerate even more. I continued my shift, trying to ignore what had happened. But things got even stranger. When I got back to the station to return the truck, I noticed that there was something in the passenger seat. It was the envelope. The same envelope I had left at home. It was closed, but now it seemed heavier, as if there was something inside. I refused to open. I took it straight to the supervisor and explained, trying to look calm, that the package had been delivered at the wrong address and should be sent back. He looked at the envelope for a moment, then at me with a strange expression. "That address is not on your route," he said, as he typed into the system. When he showed the screen, I almost fell back. Number 48 did not exist in the register. There was no house at that address. After hearing that, I started to feel a lump in my stomach. I knew the house was there. I passed it every day and saw it with my own eyes. I tried to argue with my supervisor, but he just shook his head and said that I must be confusing it with somewhere else. But how could I be confused? I knew every street of that route. Without wanting to sound crazy, I took the envelope back and said that I would solve the problem the next day. What I really wanted was to get out of there and try to understand what was going on. I went home, but the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. All night long, I had the impression that someone was watching me, even inside my apartment. The next morning, I decided to go back to the neighborhood on my own, outside of working hours. I parked the car down the street and walked to where the house was supposed to be. But it wasn't there. The space where number 48 should be was just an empty lot, with tall grass and no indication that a house had ever existed there. I felt my whole body getting cold. It was clear that something very strange was happening. Before I could get back to the car, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was the same low and distant murmur I had heard the day before. I looked back, and the empty lot seemed darker, as if the shadows were accumulating there. I did not wait to see anything else. I ran back to the car and left, but so far, I feel that it is not over. Still wake up at night listening to the murmurs, and I can't get rid of the feeling that somehow I took something with me. Call of the Void. Working as a ranger has always been something I liked. The silence of the forests, the isolation, and even the mystery of the nights were things that I found reassuring. At least, that's what I thought until the night everything changed. The outpost where I work is in the heart of a national park, away from any city or main road. During the day, I monitor trails, check visitor records, and help those who get lost. But at night, my job is basically to watch the radio and make sure everything is in order. The only strange rule I was given when I started was never to answer radio calls after midnight. They are not real, they said. I laughed when I heard that, thinking it was a joke among the veterans, but over time, I began to realize that no one treated this rule as a joke. The night it happened, the park was especially quiet. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if there's something wrong. It was almost 1 a.m. when I heard the sound on the radio. A soft static that gradually became a voice. At first, I thought it was just interference, but then the words became clear. Help. I'm stuck. Please help. The voice sounded like someone in panic, but there was something strange about it. It was familiar. I got up from the chair, feeling my heart racing. I adjusted the radio to try to improve the signal, but the voice kept oscillating between clear and distorted. Then I heard something that made my blood cold. The voice said my name. It was my own voice calling for help. My mind froze. It was impossible. How could anyone be using my voice on the radio? Still, there I was, or at least something that sounded exactly like me, asking for help. The voice said things that were frighteningly specific. I am near the East Trail. Please help me. Is here with me. I knew there was no one on the East Trail. Had made the early rounds and checked the visitors register, and the park was closed for the season. But hearing my own voice, full of despair, made me upset in a way I had never felt before. I did not answer. I remembered the rule, don't interact with distress calls after midnight. But it was easier to talk than to do. The radio was silent for a few seconds, and I started to think it was over. Then I heard again, but this time was different. The voice was still mine, but now it seemed weaker, more drawn, as if it were struggling to get out. You need to come. It's coming for you. The lights of the outpost began to flash, and I felt an inexplicable cold in the room. It was as if the air had become heavier, difficult to breathe. I took my flashlight and approached the door, trying to convince myself that it was just some kind of interference in the radio. But before I left, I heard something that paralyzed me. Outside, on the trail leading to the post, I heard footsteps. Heavy, uneven steps, as if something was approaching. The steps were slow, but there was something wrong with the sound. They echoed in a strange way, as if whatever was out there was not walking on the ground, but dragging something along. I took my radio and tried to call on the main channel, but only received static in response. There was no one around to help me, and I knew it. I took a deep breath and opened the outpost door slowly. The night was cold, and the absolute silence was only broken by the steps that seemed closer. Pointed the lantern to the path and began to walk carefully, firm hand in the handle of the stick that I carry for self-defense. The beam of light illuminated the trees ahead, but there was nothing visible. After a few steps, the sound stopped. The silence came back suddenly, but it only increased my anxiety. Then I realized something that made me freeze. On the right side of the trail, I saw marks on the ground. They were deep footprints, but they did not seem human. They had a strange shape, as if from a giant hand, and the marks went straight into the dense forest. My heart was racing, but something worse happened. From the radio attached to my waist, the static came back. This time it wasn't just static. The voice was back, but now it seemed even closer, as if it were in the same place as me. And then, with the clear and drawn sound, I heard again my own voice say, "Why did you leave?" I felt my whole body hang. That sentence, my own voice saying, "Why did you leave?" echoed in my head. It made no sense. I looked around, lighting the trail with the lantern, but all I saw were still trees, dense shadows and marks on the ground that disappeared in the forest. My first reaction was to run back to the post, but something told me that if I did this, it would follow me. Then I made the decision to go to the east track, the place that voice had mentioned. I needed to see with my own eyes. Each step I took seemed heavier, and the cold around me increased, even with sweat running down my face. As I approached the fork to the east trail, I noticed that the trees around looked different. The leaves were dark, almost black, and there was a strange smell in the air, metallic, like rust. The track, which was usually well marked, seemed to be erased, as if the ground had been scrambled. Then I heard again, not by radio, but very close. "Help me, you are here with me." It was my voice. It was impossible, but I was sure it was coming from the next forest. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound and saw something moving between the trees. It was not clear, but it seemed wrong, as if the darkness itself had a form. I took a step back, but before I could react, I heard heavy steps coming straight at me. The steps were so close that the ground seemed to vibrate. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I tried to focus the light towards the sound, but all I saw was a blur of movement between the trees. Then, doing nothing, the steps stopped. Silence returned, but this time it was oppressive, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. It was at that moment I felt something was behind me. I didn't hear anything approaching, but the feeling was unmistakable, as if a huge presence was peering over me. I didn't hear anything approaching, but the feeling was unmistakable, as if a huge presence was peering over me. Slowly I turned, with the lantern pointed ahead, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by darkness. And then I saw. It was not something I could fully describe. It was a tall, shapeless silhouette with a texture that seemed to be always moving, like smoke mixed with shadows. But what really made me freeze were the eyes. Two highlights, like pale lights, that stared at me. The thing didn't move, but I knew it was watching me, analyzing. And then to my horror she spoke. "You shouldn't have left." It was my voice again, but now that distorted thing came out, as if being chewed while it was said. The ecological sound or in the forest, and at that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I ran like never before in my life, feeling the weight of what follows me. I don't know how, but it seemed that she was everywhere at once. Every step of mine seemed to echo through the forest, while the sound of something dragging and moving fast was coming right behind. The lights of the flashlight were flashing, almost out, and for a moment I thought I couldn't get back to the post. Finally, I saw a small illuminated structure in the middle of the darkness and ran straight to the door. As I walked in, I slammed the door hard and locked it, my chest going up and down as if I had just escaped a nightmare. But the silence inside the post was not comforting. It was heavy, suffocating. I approached the radio, but before you could touch it, hearing the sound of something scratching the door. It was not a loud sound, but deliberate, as if the thing was waiting for me to do something. Then for the last time, the radio came alive. The static was answered by my voice, but now it didn't seem desperate. It seemed calm, almost exhausted. "You can't escape. Now you know." I stood there, motionless, staring at the radio while the scratching on the door stopped. I don't know how long I was standing still, but when I finally cried out for courage to open the door at dawn, there was nothing out there, only the silence of the park. I asked for a transfer on the same day, but until today, I wake up hearing my own voice whispering in the dark. The steps were so close that the ground seemed to vibrate. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I tried to focus the light towards the sound. but all I saw was a blur of movement between the trees. Then, doing nothing, the steps stopped. Silence returned, but this time it was oppressive, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. It was at that moment I felt something was behind me. I didn't hear anything approaching, but the feeling was unmistakable, as if a huge presence was peering over me. I didn't hear anything approaching, but the feeling was unmistakable, as if a huge presence was peering over me. Slowly I turned, with the lantern pointed ahead, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by darkness. And then I saw. It was not something I could fully describe. It was a tall, shapeless silhouette with a texture that seemed to be always moving, like smoke mixed with shadows. But what really made me freeze were the eyes. Two highlights, like pale lights, that stared at me. The thing didn't move, but I knew it was watching me, analyzing. And then to my horror she spoke. "You shouldn't have left." It was my voice again, but now that distorted thing came out, as if being chewed while it was said. The ecological sound, or in the forest, and at that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I ran like never before in my life, feeling the weight of what follows me. I don't know how, but it seemed that she was everywhere at once. Every step of mine seemed to echo through the forest, while the sound of something dragging and moving fast was coming right behind. The lights of the flashlight were flashing, almost out, and for a moment I thought I couldn't get back to the post. Finally, I saw a small illuminated structure in the middle of the darkness and ran straight to the door. As I walked in, I slammed the door hard and locked it, my chest going up and down as if I had just escaped a nightmare. But the silence inside the post was not comforting. It was heavy, suffocating. I approached the radio, but before you could touch it, hearing the sound of something scratching the door. It was not a loud sound, but deliberate, as if the thing was waiting for me to do something. Then, for the last time, the radio came alive. The static was answered by my voice, but now it didn't seem desperate. It seemed calm, almost exhausted. "You can't escape. Now you know." I stood there, motionless, staring at the radio while the scratching on the door stopped. I don't know how long I was standing still, but when I finally cried out for courage to open the door at dawn, there was nothing out there, only the silence of the park. I asked for a transfer on the same day, but until today, I wake up hearing my own voice whispering in the dark. The sealed unity. I have been working as a night manager in a 24-hour warehouse for almost a year. It's a quiet job most of the time. Most customers come during the day, so at night, the place is practically empty. It's just me, the security cameras, and a lot of quiet corridors filled with storage units. From my first day, I received a strange instruction that was etched in my head. Never open Unit 214, no matter what happens. If you hear something, ignore it. I thought that was strange, but since it was part of the training, I decided not to question it. I did not pass near that unit that could be avoided. She stayed at the end of aisle 7, in an area little used, and there was never a record of customers going there. That night, something different happened. I was in the control room, checking the cameras as usual, when I noticed something on the monitor that showed Hall 7. One of the lights blinked, projecting strange shadows on the walls. It would not be anything of another world, if it were not for the movement. A shape quickly passed through the corner of the screen, as if something had moved near Unit 214. I tried to adjust the camera angle, but I couldn't see anything else. I watched for a few minutes, trying to convince myself that it was just a technical glitch or maybe a reflection, but then the light stopped blinking. The hallway was completely dark, except for a small emergency light on the ceiling. Something didn't seem right. My first impulse was to stay where I was and continue watching through the cameras, but a curiosity began to corrode me. I took a flashlight and a radio just to feel a little safer and went to aisle 7. As I walked, the place looked different, colder, as if the air there was heavier. When I got to the entrance of the corridor, I saw that one of the lights was really out, leaving everything with a mood even more gloomy. Unit 214 was just at the end, and as I approached, I started to hear a low sound. It was difficult to describe, something between a suggestion and a scratch. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, trying to hear better, but the sound seemed to come from inside the unit. I looked at the door of Unit 214. It was a normal door like all the others, with a big heavy padlock. But the strangest thing was that the lock seemed to be swinging slightly, as if something was vibrating the door from inside. My heart started to shoot, but it kept moving. When I got close enough, the sound became clearer. It sounded like voices, not screams or groans, but conversations muffled, fast, as if many people were talking at the same time. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening, when I heard something even worse. 3 strong beats coming from inside the unit. They were so loud that they echoed through the corridor, and I almost dropped my flashlight. The beats stopped so suddenly when they started, but the feeling that something was watching me got even stronger. I wanted to run, but my feet were stuck on the ground. The door of Unit 214 was still now, but the quietness that agitated it was even more disturbing. I looked back at the long empty corridor and had a feeling that if I walked away, that thing inside the unit would not stay there for long. I took the radio and called my supervisor. I told him there was a strange movement in Unit 214 and asked for instructions. The answer was short and dry: get out of there. Go back to the control room and continue monitoring. Do not touch the unit. I went back to the control room, but my heart was still racing. I was glued to the screens of the cameras, focusing on Corridor 7. Some minutes passed in complete silence, and I began to convince myself that maybe I had imagined everything. But then something changed. The camera that pointed directly at Unit 214 started to fail, blinking between clear images and a screen full of static. In one of the flashes, I saw something that almost made me fall off my chair. The door to the unit was ajar. It wasn't possible. I knew the lock was intact when I left. The camera blinked again, and this time I saw a shadow slowly passing through the crack of the door, as if something was coming out. The camera blinked between static and brief footage of the corridor, but one thing was clear. Something had come out of Unit 214. I was frozen, unable to look away from the screen. The shadow seemed to move slowly, almost dragged, but the strangest thing was how deformed it looked. It wasn't a person, that I was sure of. The proportions were wrong, as if the limbs were too long or bent at impossible angles. Then the camera went out for good, leaving the screen completely black. A second later, I heard the sound, not by the radio, but coming directly from the corridor. Steps. They were dragged, but still important, as if something very big was going on out there. Took my radio again and called the supervisor, but there was no answer. Nor static, nothing. The feeling of isolation was suffocating, as if the whole building had become different. Took a flashlight and drove to the control room door, opening it just enough to look out into the main corridor. The place seemed darker than it should, even with the lights still on. Unit 214 was 2 miles away, but the feeling that something was coming towards me was unmistakable. It was then that I saw a shadow crossing the end of the corridor, long and erratic, moving with a disturbing slowness. There was nothing except the slight drag that seemed to echo throughout the building. Took my radio again and called the supervisor, but there was no answer. Nor static, nothing. The feeling of isolation was suffocating, as if the whole building had become different. Took a flashlight and drove to the control room door, opening it just enough to look out into the main corridor. The place seemed darker than it should, even with the lights still on. Unit 214 was 2 miles away, but the feeling that something was coming towards me was unmistakable. It was then that I saw a shadow crossing the end of the corridor, long and erratic, moving with a disturbing slowness. There was nothing except the slight drag that seemed to echo throughout the building. I closed the control room door as fast as I could and locked it. My whole body was shaking, and I can barely hold a flashlight. I felt in the corner of the room, with my eyes fixed on the door, trying to convince myself that it was not real. But the silence of the building was too heavy, and the feeling that something was approaching did not stop. Then I heard again. It was no longer the sound of steps or something dragging, but beats. 3 firm beats, just like I had heard in Unit 214, only now they were at the control room door. I tried to get up, but my legs were fighting. I picked up the radio, pressing the button hard, but again there was only silence. The beats continued, stronger and faster, as if the other side became impatient. That's when I heard a low voice, almost a whisper, but impossible to ignore. Open the door. It was not any voice. It was mine. Hearing her ask me to open the door was enough to take that trance away. I ran to the opposite corner of the room, holding the lantern as if it could protect me, while the beats stopped suddenly. The silence came back, but I knew that it was still there waiting. The silence in the room was unbearable. My heart beat so fast that it seemed to fill the space. For a moment I thought it was gone, but then I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the knock on the door anymore. It was something scraping the surface of the metal, as if long and sharp nails were scratching the structure. The voice came back, but this time it didn't seem like mine. It was distorted, dragged, as if something was trying to imitate my tone, but without success. You know that you are here, for me. Every word seemed to be dragging through the room, as if it was vibrating itself. Then the lights in the control room began to flash, and the radio came back to life. The static mixed with fragments of words, overlapping voices, some familiar, others completely unknown. It was at that moment I saw, below the door, a small space let out a shadow. It wasn't outside. The shadow was coming in, crawling on the ground, as if seeking to reach me. The lantern blinked, and in the brief moment of light, I saw something forming from that shadow, something deformed, which seemed to smile, but not with a mouth. It was as if the very dark were coming to life. I closed my eyes and began to pray, hoping that it would end. When I opened my eyes, the silence was directed, but something was wrong. The shadow under the door had disappeared, and the radio was off. I didn't know if it was a break or an announcement of something worse. I stood up slowly, still holding the lantern, and looked at the door. As much as there was no more sound or movement, the feeling that I was being present was overwhelming. It was then that he realized that the lights in the control room were flashing again, but this time in a strange pattern, as if someone was trying to send a message. Before I could react, All the lights went out at once, leaving the room in complete darkness. And then the door of the control room began to open. It was not a sudden or ordered movement, but slow and deliberate, as if someone on the other side knew I was watching and wanted to prolong my terror. The lantern trembled in my hand, and I pointed to the door, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness of the corridor. A strong smell, like burning metal, invaded the space, and a cold chill took hold of the room. In the open door, I saw something that I will never forget. The shape that was once only a shadow had now manifested. It was tall, grotesque, with contours that change every second. The eyes, if it had eyes, were 2 points that burned in the darkness, fixed on me. I need nothing more. I ran to the emergency exit and did not look back. I ran through the halls, feeling each step heavier, as if something was pulling air around me. The flashlight blinked nonstop, illuminating only a few pieces of the way in front of me, but enough to guide me to the emergency exit. Behind me, the sound of something dragging and hitting the walls got higher, as if it was approaching. When I finally reached the exit door, I forced the handle with all the force that I had, pushing it to open. The cold air of the night hit me like a punch, but it was enough to make me feel that for at least an instant I was safe. Ran out to the parking lot, without looking back, and got into my car. My heart seemed to explode as I started the engine and sped away from there. The tank was left behind, but the feeling that I was not alone in the car accompanied me all the time. I came home tremendous, locked all the doors and tried to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. The weirdest thing happened the next morning. I got a call from my supervisor asking why I had left shift in the middle of the night. I tried to explain, but he cut my speech with a sentence that left me speechless. Unit 214? There is no Unit 214 in this warehouse. To this day, I have nightmares about that night. The scariest thing? Sometimes I still hear the door banging. A remote oil platform in the North Atlantic. I was hired to work on an oil rig in the North Atlantic about a month ago. I took the job because the salary was great and I was in need of money, but I never imagined that it would be so isolated. The platform was hundreds of miles from the coast, surrounded only by sea and constant wind. In the first days, everything seemed normal, but the most well-known guys knew me from some strange advice. The most repeated was, avoid the north side of the platform at night. No matter the reason, do not go there. I thought it was some kind of joke or superstition. After all, people make up things to spend time in these isolated places. But the more I listened, the more serious the warning sounded. No one would laugh or make jokes about it. The night it happened, I was on duty monitoring systems. The sea was rough, and the wind was so strong that the windows were shaking. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a warning sounded on the panels. It was a failure in one of the hydraulic systems, exactly on the north side. At that moment, I felt a shiver. I thought to ignore, after all, the rule was clear. But the alarms began to become more insistent, decreasing that the pressure in the valves was rising dangerously. If that was not resolved, it could cause a serious problem. Took my flashlight, my radio, and decided to go there, even with the warning echoing in my head. The north side of the platform was more exposed to the wind, and the darkness there seemed denser than anywhere else. As I walked, the sound of the sea beating against the metal structure mixed with the constant whistle of the wind. At every step, I looked to the sides but saw no one. It was as if that side of the platform was forgotten, abandoned. When I got close to the problem area, the hydraulic panel was exactly where it should be, but it looked strange. Had rust marks and stains that did not make sense, considering the equipment worked regularly. The light of my flashlight flickered, blinking as if something interfered with it. I started checking the valves, trying to concentrate, but the noise around me seemed to be changing. It was no longer just the sound of the wind or the sea. There seemed to be something else, a kind of rhythmic beat, almost like metallic steps, echoing from the catwalks above me. I looked up, but the darkness was almost impenetrable. I called on the radio, trying to check if someone was on the north side with me, but only received static as an answer. Suddenly, a loud sound burst, as if something had fallen or been dragged near the panel. My heart shot, and the flashlight blinked once more before turning off completely. I was in the middle of that darkness, with only the sound of that strange rhythm around me. In total darkness, I forced myself to stand still for a few seconds, trying to control my breath and understand what was happening. The rhythmic sound continued, but it seemed to be changing places, as if it was circling around me. My first impulse was to run, but the walkways were narrow and slippery, and the slightest mistake could break me right into the rough sea below. I decided to turn on a flashlight again, hoping it would work. When the beam of light came back, it illuminated the panel in front of me, but what he saw was paralyzed. The stains that once looked like rust now had a darker color and were spread across the floor, forming a trail that went towards one of the stairs. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that it was oil, but the metallic smell in the air told me otherwise. My radio, which was silent until then, released a sudden noise, a high static that almost made me release it. There is no static, I heard something. A voice, or at least it seemed to be. It was low, almost a whisper, but there was something strange about it. It was in no language I recognized, but still seemed familiar. Before I could understand what I was hearing, the sound stopped and the radio went silent. The worst came soon after. The rhythmic sound I heard before changed to something heavier, closer, as if something very big happened moving directly towards me. I knew I had to get out of there, but my feet are not stuck on the ground. The sound was getting closer and closer, and now I could feel the vibration in the metal under my feet. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I lit around, trying to see what was causing it. The light finally caught something, but I wish I had not seen it. At the end of the catwalk, right at the entrance to a corridor leading to the north side, there was a silhouette. It was not human, I was sure. It was tall, disproportionate, with arms that did not stretch beyond the natural. The thing was immobile, but it seemed to pulse, as if the body itself were alive in a wrong way. The eyes, if I can call it that, were 2 points that were not fixed on me. I took a step back, trying to move away, and that's when it moved. He did not walk or run, but seemed to slide, with a sound of dragging echoing through the corridor. The light of the lantern blinked again, and for a moment, everything was dark. When the light came back, it was closer, now occupying almost the whole corridor. No noise, but the pressure in the air around me increased, as if space was being taken by something invisible. I turned and started running as fast as I could, hearing the metallic sound behind me. I didn't look back. Each step seemed endless, and the panic only increased as the sound got louder, closer. I ran down the catwalks as if my life depended on it, and probably depended. The metallic sound behind me became louder and faster, as if it was chasing me. The narrow walkways swung under my feet, and every turn I made seemed to take me deeper into the platform. The flashlight kept flashing, and in one of the flashes, I saw a giant shadow behind me. She moved in an unnatural way, as if she was crawling and at the same time parading in the air. The worst was that the metallic smell had intensified, and now it seemed to be inside my own mouth, as if I were breathing it. Finally, I saw the entrance of the main sector. There were more lights, but the sound behind me did not stop. When I crossed the door and closed it with force, the noise stopped instantly. The silence was so deep that it seemed impossible that seconds ago I was being pursued. I looked at the control panel next to me and saw something that froze my blood. The hydraulic warning in the northern area had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Picked up the radio again, trying to contact someone, but there was only static. It was then that, in the middle of the static, I heard again that voice, low and distorted, speaking in a language that I could not understand. And the last word she said so clearly, as if it were directly to me, "Come back." After hearing that word, I was completely paralyzed. There was no way back. I knew that if this happened, something much worse would happen. I decided to run into the main room, where they found the other equipment and security records, thinking that maybe I would find some explanation or at least a way to ask for help. When I got there, the place was empty. There was no one, and all the monitors were off except for one. The screen showed the north side of the platform, and in the center, right where I was minutes before, there was something on the ground. It was a dark trail, as if something had been dragged away until it disappeared at the edge of the structure. Before I could react, the monitor started blinking. An image quickly appeared, but it wasn't from the north side. It was from the room where I was. I saw on the screen, standing there, looking at the monitor, but something was wrong. There was a shadow behind me, almost imperceptible but definitely present. I turned immediately, but there was nothing there. The silence in the room was suffocating, and the metallic smell came back with full force. Don't wait to see what else could happen. Took my things and ran to the central radio, trying to send an evacuation request. Before I could finish the message, I heard the voice for the last time, clear and unmistakable. "There is no way out." The concrete cabinet. I always dreamed of having my own house, even if it needed renovations. When I bought that old house, I found it would be an interesting project and a chance to create a home. The structure was old, full of little problems, but the price was great and the place looked cozy, at least in the beginning. In the basement, I found most of the work. It was a big space but full of rubble and with several cracked walls. It was during one of these cleanups that I noticed something strange, a wall that looked different from the others. The finish was thicker, almost as if it were necessary to do that in a hurry, and there was a built-in closet, but made of concrete, which did not make sense. Who would build such a strange closet in a basement? My curiosity was immediate. I took a flashlight and approached, realizing that the cabinet had a small opening at the bottom, as if something had been left there. I put my hand, and my fingers touched the paper. It was a letter. The handwriting was hasty, almost impossible to read, but the words I managed to decipher froze me. "Do not open. Do not destroy the concrete. For the love of God, leave everything as it is." For some reason, I feel a shiver in my whole body. It was just a closet, I thought. Probably a joke from someone who lived there before. But something in that note seemed more than just a warning. It was a desperate request. Hold the letter in my hands for a few minutes, trying to understand why someone would write something like that. But the more I looked at the concrete cabinet, the more it bothered me. It seemed out of place, as if it had not been made part of the original construction. Curiosity began to overcome fear, and I decided to investigate further. I took a tool that had brought for the renovation and started to hit the concrete, trying to hear if there was something hollow behind. The vibration was strange, as if the sound wasn't totally muffled, but also didn't echo as it should. It was hard to explain, but it seemed wrong. Something in that concrete seemed alive. As I continued to examine, I felt a change in the atmosphere of the basement. The air became heavier, and a strange smell began to spread, something like burnt metal mixed with moisture. My instinct was to stop, but the curiosity was stronger. I started hammering into the concrete, trying to open a piece. That's when I heard the first sound. A snap. It didn't seem to come from the concrete, but from inside it. I stopped immediately with my heart beating. I was silent, trying to hear better, and then came again. It was a low sound, almost as if something was getting confused inside. At that moment, I had the feeling that I was no longer alone in the basement. The sound continued, intermittent, as if something was scraping against the concrete inside. My heart seemed to want to come out of the mouth, but I tried to convince myself that it was just some animal stuck there, maybe a mouse or something like that. Hold the hammer harder and hit some more concrete, just enough to open a small gap. When the first layer gave way, an even stronger smell came from inside. It was sour, metallic, something I had never felt before. I looked inside with the lantern, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by darkness. I could not see anything clearly, only undefined forms and an inexplicable feeling that it was sour, metallic, something I had never felt before. I looked inside with the flashlight, but the beam of light seemed to be swallowed up by darkness. I could not see anything clearly, only undefined shapes and an inexplicable feeling that something was looking back at me. As I tried to understand what I was selling, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. A low breath, rhythmic but undeniably close. Released the tool at the same time and backed, with the lantern still pointed to the hole in the concrete. It was then that something moved. It was not big, but fast, like a shadow that slid to the bottom of the closet. The lantern shook in my hand, and I took another step back, almost stumbling into the rubble of the basement. The letter I had found fell to the ground, and it was at that moment that I realized that she had something written on the back. I took it with trembling hands and turned. The words were even more disturbing. If it has come this far, it is already too late. When I read these words, I felt as if the air around me had become denser, almost suffocating. The strong smell that came out of the closet now seemed to fill the entire basement, making it impossible to breathe properly. I knew that I should leave from there, but something kept me paralyzed, as if I was trapped by a fear that was beyond instinct. The lantern kept pointing at the hole in the concrete, and that's when I realized. The space inside was not a normal closet. It looked like a narrow tunnel, with walls that seemed to pulsate slightly, as if they were alive. It was impossible. It was concrete, but it seemed organic. Suddenly, the scratching sound came back, louder and frantic, as if something was trying to come out hard. My instinct was finally broken, and I dropped the flashlight and ran towards the stairs. Went up as fast as I could, tripping on the steps, but before reaching the door that led to the upper floor, hearing something behind me. A sound that I can't fully describe. It was a mixture of a moan and a muffled scream, as if several voices were mixed into one. I looked back by reflection, and for a brief moment, I saw something coming out of the hole in the concrete. It was not solid, but a dark shape that seemed to stretch out, as if trying to reach where I was. Did not waste time watching. I went up the stairs with all my strength, feeling that presence behind me, as if being pulled into the cellar. When I reached the door, I hit it hard to close it, but something seemed to hold it. Do not know how I got it, but pushed everything and managed to lock it with the improvised work that had put days before. I leaned against her for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath. The silence upstairs was supposed to be comforting, but it was oppressive. The metallic smell was still in the air, and now it seemed to be impregnating my clothes, my skin. It was then that I heard the sound coming from the basement again. But this time, it wasn't a muffled or distant sound. They were knocked on the door, rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if whatever was there was testing my determination. I picked up the phone, trying to call someone, but the signal was completely dead, something that never happened inside the house. The beat stopped suddenly, but before I could breathe relieved, I heard a hint. It was low, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to make me paralyzed. "Let me out." The voice was strangely familiar, as if it were my own voice. That voice paralyzed me. It couldn't have been mine, but it sounded so much like a distorted recording. I moved away from the door, with my heart beating so hard that it seemed to echo in the silence of the house. The beat stopped, but the continuous whisper, now spreading like an echo that seemed to come from every corner. "You can't leave me here." The phrase was repeated, mixing different tones, as if several versions of it were said at the same time. I took the keys of the car and ran towards the front door, decided to leave there and never come back. But when I tried to open the handle, it seemed to be locked, as if something on the other side was dark. The whole house started to creak, as if it were alive, and the sound of steps, many steps, began to echo from upstairs, even though I informed that there was no one there. I looked at the staircase leading to the rooms, and at the top, for a moment, I saw a shadow. It was tall, deformed, like something trying to mold itself into human form but failing. "Don't wait to see anything else." I ran to the nearest window, broke it open with my elbow and jumped out. As I ran through the garden, I looked back one last time. All the lights in the house were on, and in the basement a window showed what seemed to be the concrete hole shining with a dark light, almost impossible to explain. Since that night, I have never returned. But sometimes in the silence of the morning, I still hear that voice in the back of my mind. "Let me out." A mountain observatory. I have been working in an observatory on the mountain for a few years, and I always liked the tranquility of the place. High on that mountain, far from the light pollution, the sky seems like another world, full of stars and mysteries. My job is usually routine, adjusting equipment, collecting data, and taking notes for research. But since I started, one rule has always been clear: never redirect the telescope to a specific sector of the sky. At first, I found that there was some technical limitation, maybe an interference or something like that. But nobody ever explained why, and it always intrigued me. The sector in question didn't even have a name, just places we should avoid. The night it happened, I was alone on shift. This was not unusual, as I won in solitary shifts to enjoy the best conditions of the sky. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I noticed that the telescope had lost alignment. It was a small problem, but it needs to be corrected manually. While making the adjustments, noticed that it had turned near the forbidden area. I tried to redirect it back, but something in the system crashed. The gears work, but the image on the monitor remains fixed. It was then that I realized that the telescope was pointing exactly to that sector we were told to avoid. My first occurrence was to shut everything down and try to restart the system, but before I could do that, an image started appearing on the screen. The image on the screen was confusing at first, full of interference and lines that distorted vision. But as the system adjusted focus, I started to see details. It wasn't what I expected, no stars or constellations. It was something different. It looked like a geometric pattern, but not natural. Precise lines, almost like circuits, that moved slightly, as if they were pulsating. I looked at it for a few seconds, trying to understand what was selling. My mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but all I knew was that it should not be there. The pattern seemed alive somehow. As I watched, something even stranger happened. The lines began to change, forming what appeared to be a symbol. It was not a common pattern, It was something I seemed to face. A feeling of discomfort came out of me, as if I was being present. I tried to look away, but it seemed impossible. My vision was stuck on the screen, and it was when I noticed something even more disturbing. The pattern began to move in sync with my breathing. When I was inspired, it expanded. When it expired, it contracted. That wasn't a coincidence. Something out there, I was responding. At that moment, everything in me screamed to turn off the equipment and get out of there, but I could not move. It was as if something invisible was holding me in the chair, forcing me to keep looking at the screen. The geometric pattern started to change again, but this time it was faster, almost frantic. The lines crumble and are rebuilt, forming something that looked like a face, or at least an attempt to imitate it. The eyes of that figure, if they were eyes, approached fixed on me, even through the screen. It was impossible not to feel that it was trying to communicate, or worse, trying to get into my mind. Then the radio in the room started emitting static. I had left it on for emergencies, but now it was full of noises, with a low sound, almost like whispers in the background. I was trying to figure out if it was interference or something else when I heard a voice. It wasn't any voice. It was my own. "You shouldn't be looking at this." The radio went off immediately, leaving a room in complete silence. The pattern on the screen blinked, becoming more intense, almost like a pulsating light. It was at this moment that I felt a pressure in my head, as if something was trying to pull me forward into that image. The pressure in my head became unbearable, as if something was trying to invade my mind. By reflex, I turned off the monitor, but the feeling did not stop. It was as if the image was still engraved in my landscapes, even with my eyes closed. I went to the radio and tried to call for help, but everything that came out was static, mixed with fragments of that same voice, my voice. It was impossible to discern the words, but the tone was urgent, almost supplicant. I began to feel the environment around me changing. Then I heard something that made my blood cold. It was not coming from the radio, nor from the monitor. It was a sound that seemed to be coming from inside the room itself. A low and constant buzz, like a vibration, but with an almost organic quality. I looked at the telescope and realized that it was moving on its own, adjusting its position. The gears were turning slowly, but I knew the system was off. The lens now pointed directly to the same forbidden sector. The geometric pattern came back to my mind clearly, as if it was being projected inside me, and I felt that something was trying to call me. Not physically, but mentally. That buzzing in the room seemed to grow, and the sound mixed with the rhythm of my heart, which beat out of control. It was as if everything around me was synchronized with what the telescope pointed. I tried pulling the main power switch to cut off any connection with the equipment, but even with everything turned off, the telescope kept moving. The most frightening thing was to realize that the lens was no longer just pointing at that forbidden sector of the sky. She seemed to be adjusted for something much closer, something that somehow was here. I looked at the monitor, which I was sure had turned off, and it blinked again. The geometric lines were back, but this time they weren't just patterns. They were forming strange symbols, almost like a language, something I could not understand, but it seemed directed at me. The hum in the room became almost deafening, and then in the middle of it I heard clearly a single word. "Come on!" It wasn't a human voice, but it was in my head, and it was impossible to ignore. The telescope began to vibrate, and I felt that if I did not leave at that moment, something terrible would happen. But at the same time, it was as if an invisible force pulled me, as if that call could not resist. I decided that I couldn't stay in that room another second. Took my things and ran to the exit, but the door seemed more distant than before, as if space was stretching around me. Each step seemed heavy, and the hum in the room did not stop. Finally, I reached the handle, but as I tried to turn it, I felt a resistance, as if something was sent from the other side. It was at this point that the telescope began to emit a faint, almost imperceptible light, which reflected on the walls. When I looked back, the geometric pattern was no longer on the monitor. He now seemed projected directly through the lens of the telescope, floating in the middle of the room. The pattern pulsed, almost breathed, and seemed to grow, expand, filling the environment. The geometric shapes began to distort, as if something was emerging from them. It was a shapeless form, impossible to describe, but that seemed to be watching me back. That voice, or whatever it was, repeated again, but this time louder, like an echo inside my head. Come. Finally, I managed to open the door and run outside. The cold of the mountain hit me hard, but I did not stop. I ran to the farthest point I could, looking back only once. The lights of the observatory flickered, and I could see shadows moving inside, as if something was alive on those walls. Even from the outside, the buzzing seemed to follow me, echoing in my mind like a memory I couldn't erase. Stood in the cold, trying to convince myself that it was not real, what I was imagining. But when I looked up at the sky, something made me freeze. The forbidden sector, that piece of heaven that should never be observed, was different. There were no stars there. It was as if an absolute emptiness had taken hold, a darkness that seemed to pulse, exactly like the pattern I had seen on the monitor. The feeling that something was watching me back became even stronger, almost tangible. I tried to get further away, but my vision began to blur. For a moment, I thought it was the cold, but then I realized that the images were coming back like flashes in my mind. The geometric shapes, the symbols, the voice. Everything seemed to be rooting in my head, as if I could never escape from those. When I finally managed to get myself together and reach one of the emergency radios outside, I only heard static, but in the middle of it, once again, a voice appeared. You open the door. Don't wait for anything else. I took the car from the base and went down the mountain as fast as I could. I asked for a mission the next day, but even today, whenever I look at the sky, I feel that emptiness is there watching me, as if I had brought something with me.